In this video, I will demonstrate a vendor process approval workflow integrated with a SharePoint document library using Nintex Workflow Cloud and Microsoft SharePoint development instances with workflow portability design in mind. This is especially helpful in cases where you want to design your workflows in a development environment and export them over to a production environment that uses different lists and libraries. For the sake of time, in this lesson, I am assuming you already know how to use Nintex Workflow Cloud workflow variables, start event variables, and SharePoint online related actions. I assume that you also know how to export and import workflows in Nintex Workflow Cloud. My example document library is set up with fields to capture procedure documents and information from a vendor who manufactures parts as a supplier to my business. The workflow for this process is configured to start when a list item is updated and the Start Workflow column is set to Yes in the document library. Now, this workflow is a basic document approval process, but has some requirements to update column values for the document when an instance runs. It also needs to take an approved copy of the procedure document and archive it to another document library not related to the start event. To begin, I have created two workflow variables that are meant to store the site URL and library name of my archive document library because it is separate from the library tied to the start event for this workflow. I have also configured a variable that contains a list of email addresses for approvers that will be used in an assign a task to multiple approvers action. The start event for a SharePoint online workflow is always going to have to point to the specific list or library the workflow is intended for, so we can leave the start event alone. The next action in this workflow uses the SharePoint Online Update Items action to update the Start Workflow and Review Status columns in the library. For this step, you must initially enter the SharePoint site URL and click Retrieve List to make the action column aware. Then, select the columns to update as needed. Once configured, you can change the SharePoint site URL property to use the site URL variable from the Start Context variable. You can also use the list name variable in the list name property. All the other properties can stay as they are. Next, to save some time, I'll copy this action and place it in both the Reject and Approve paths. I'll also update the properties accordingly for the Review Status column and remove the Start Workflow column, since that isn't necessary to use in these later steps. I also wanted to configure the SharePoint Online, copy or move a file action in a similar fashion, so I configure the source file settings for that action to use the SharePoint site URL and document library name variables from the Start Variable Context object. For the destination location, I configured it to use the site URL and library name workflow variables that were set up to point to the archive library. The same pattern of pre-configuration was also applied to the SharePoint Online Update Items action, as you can see here on my screen. Then the site URL and list name properties were changed to use variables. This will take the original document item that starts the workflow and update the archived documents column values to match the original document. One last item to review is the use of the engineering approvers workflow variable in the assignees property of the Assign a Task to Multiple Approvers action. This is helpful in that you can edit the default value of this variable with the email addresses of approvers in your organization and use it throughout the workflow in multiple task assignment actions. From here, I will publish this workflow and then export it so I can turn around to import it into another Nintex Workflow Cloud environment. Okay, with the workflow exported, I can now import it into my other Nintex Workflow Cloud environment and change the workflow to point to a production SharePoint site that contains the same matching vendor process libraries as the development SharePoint site. After clicking the Import button, I'll paste the import key into the text box, then give the workflow a name. Next, we need to edit this workflow start event to point to the production SharePoint vendor process library and then update the workflow variable for the archive library to a new site URL value. But first, notice that I have named the Sharepoint connection the same as it was in my development environment. When importing a workflow into a new environment, Nintex will automatically look for a matching connection name and set the start event and other actions that use that connection to use it by default if it exists. Some use cases may require a different connection name, so if that is your case, you will need to set the connection property here based on your requirements. That property can stay as it is, so moving on, I will enter the new site URL, retrieve lists, and select the vendor process approval library. This will automatically update the start event variable, which will in turn reflect in the actions that use site URL and list name site context object variables. Then the only other change we need to make in this example is to point the workflow variable that stores the archive library site URL value to the Sharepoint site that contains the production document library. I'll do that by editing and pasting the new URL into the default value for that variable. The archive library name and the engineering approver's email address list can both stay the same here, but you can change these values according to your needs in your production environment. With that, I have made all the changes I need in this workflow to publish to the new environment. When this workflow runs, it will use the updated values tied to the Sharepoint connection, the start event, and workflow variables throughout the workflow with minimal configuration. For more information on the topics found in this video that help with workflow portability, you can review the variables, start events, and connections topics at help.nintex.com.